Today, I'm lucky to have an amazing guest, Mr. Adrian Charles Smith. He's the author of the book, A Prison for the Mind, Reflections of a Disappointed Fundamentalist. I'm just going to read from the back page of the book here. It says, what does it mean to be a fundamentalist? What are its common characteristics and defining features? Can we escape the prison of ideological commitment, the straitjacket of conformity and groupthink? Answers are needed to avoid the endgame of fundamentalism, totalitarian control. Introducing our guest, Adrian Charles Smith entered adulthood as a minister in a fundamentalist Christian sect, a loyal follower of a man he now calls the Wizard, but as with the Wizard of Oz, all was revealed to be a sham, and his questioning of authority led to excommunication and a life in the secular world. Yet once away from the church, he observed fundamentalism in unexpected places, in the corporate world, in science and economics, in political ideologies, New Age movements, and in postmodern philosophy. Different context, yes, but the same underlying phenomenon, the same adherence to quote unquote one truth. In these adventurous essays, Smith, with equal amounts of erudition, humor, and insight, examines why we are drawn to these fundamentalist approaches. His search ranges from the caves of Nag Hammadi to the hallways of Ivy League universities, from communist Romania to Sedona, Arizona. He discovers his potential for unconscious relapse to one all-knowing wizard, but eventually realizes that fundamentalists live in isolated camps. The truly free have genuine community, and unity in the midst of disagreement is possible. This is a book about fundamentalism and all of its pervasive, insidious manifestations. I really love that you're such an interesting juxtaposition. Someone who is seeking God wholeheartedly and devoutly joins this community and realizes that you've been kind of pulled into a cult. And then awakening to that, rebuild yourself as a lawyer. So I've never met anyone like that. And if you could tell me a little bit more about your journey, and also, I'm not sure, what type of law do you practice exactly?
Well, my background in law is academic. I never actually practiced law, but I'm a graduate of the University of London in London, England, in law. And it was my main interest is the philosophy of law and constitutional law. And I found that my studies and my interests are very relevant to everything that's happening in fundamentalism. I did in one of my recent blogs talk about some of the philosophy of law, the concept of natural law versus what they call legal positivism, which is the command of the sovereign. So is law force or is it morality? And natural law is something that is coming to me as something very relevant to everything that's happening around us now.
Yes, natural law, and that's an interesting topic. There's an author here in the States named Mark Passio. His own credentials are somewhat dubious. He's actually a former Satanist, so maybe he's your bizarro inverted clone. But he has lectured for years now on natural law and bringing morality back to the law. Of course, what's happening in Canada is completely immoral.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so,
yes.
Absolutely. So the argument
is basically the command of the sovereign, orders backed by threats.
Right.
It's no different than the mafia boss, shouting out instructions or shouting out orders to his henchmen. There's no moral content to it.
Yes.
Whereas natural law says there has to be a moral content for it to be legitimized.
Right.
And we have no obligation to follow an unjust law or an immoral law simply because it's an order backed by some authoritative figure. And the Nazis found that out the hard way, that the defense of I was just following orders just didn't help them when it came to the Nuremberg trials. And the Nuremberg trials themselves were a manifestation of natural law. The legal positivists didn't like it because there was no sovereign. Or if there was a sovereign, it was Hitler, and he was the sovereign. He was given the rules, and therefore that made it okay with them.
Right.
But that those two streams of thought, are evident in the law as it is practiced and as we see it.
Yes. Interesting. And it seems to sway between those poles over time.
Yeah.
And then I guess the operative function would be the consciousness of those who are being ruled over who have forgotten their sovereignty.
Yes.
And so here we are in this great awakening, trying to reclaim our birthright, to we the people telling the government what it is that they're allowed to do rather than the reverse. And so I loved your book. It's fascinating from cover to cover. You've made the most of your disappointment with fundamentalism, and you've been dealing with the New World Order syndicate in Canada, restricting your rights for going on 2 years plus, but you could probably make the argument for the last century, but increasingly so in the last 2 years with this whole COVID fundamentalist nightmare that's been drawn across the world. Um, what do you think the next? I know you've got the trucker strikes occurring there now. What are some positive news that you've seen in developments in regards to getting out from this lockdown and getting out from this tyranny in Canada?
A number of states have been backing out of their mandates or telling us that they're going to. There have been and will be Supreme Court challenges. There's an organization in Canada called the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and they have initiated a challenge to the Emergencies Act invocated by the Trudeau government. And there is the only living signatory to Canada's Charter of Rights, Brian Peckford, a former premier of the province of Newfoundland, who has initiated a legal action, a charter violation action to the Supreme Court on the very specific issue of travel mandates, because in Canada, anyone who is not injected will not be allowed on any form of transportation, public transportation. So you cannot fly, you cannot get on a boat, you cannot get on a train, and that is being challenged. So there are the legal challenges, and we will find out. It's very difficult to see how he cannot win. It's very difficult to see how the Emergencies Act could in any way be supported by this, but because the Emergencies Act requires the threat of extreme violence. And it requires something like a war or an invasion or some threat to public safety and security. And it has never been invoked before. It goes back to 1988. The predecessor act was the War Measures Act of 1914. The War Measures Act was ironically invoked by Justin's father, Pierre Trudeau, in 1970, when there was kidnappings, murders, bombings from the Quebec Liberation Front, a terrorist organization, and he invoked it during that time. But the Emergencies Act that replaced it in 1988 never been invoked, not during 9/11, not during a major protest that shut down Canada's railway system for weeks. The economy was paralyzed, but it was the protest, the kind of protest that the government agreed with, which was to do with energy development in the West. So at that time, there was negotiation. The government sent in a negotiator, and we worked our way through it. But in this occasion, there was no negotiation, zero, nothing.
Wow.
And at a time when mandates were being rolled off internationally, even domestically, the government, the Trudeau government, piles on with an additional mandate for truckers who spend their lives in isolation in a cab, in a truck, to quarantine for 2 weeks when they cross the border from the United States into Canada. And I guess that just triggered something. And the rest is history.
Yes, and it's been going
History.
on.
Yeah.
It's been happening about 2 weeks now. I think 2 or 3
Yeah,
weeks.
that's right. Probably we're in a third week of it now. Yeah, but
And do you have an idea of some of the numbers of truckers present in Canada, and are they clustered around Ottawa in particular?
they're everywhere.
Yes.
When the protests began, the convoys were converging from all directions, but the one from out west was on the Trans-Canada Highway was 45 miles long.
Wow.
So
The
there
co
might have been 1 million people showing up in Ottawa.
Incredible.
And one of the most entertaining protests you could possibly imagine, is they set up hot tubs, saunas, barbecues, tarot readings, massages,
Wow.
bouncy castles for the kids. I mean, it was like a giant festival,
Temporary city. Wow.
and trucks from everywhere, and they were feeding the homeless, and the food banks are full in Ottawa, and they had to spread out to areas outside of Ottawa to donate to the food banks because of all the food that was being donated and the fuel. And the police tried to shut off the food and the fuel, but it didn't work. And they made it illegal to give food and fuel. And one of those orders backed by threats. There's no law, no moral law against feeding people and giving them fuel.
Yeah.
It's one of
Wow.
those orders backed by threats. So what happened was, in response to that, thousands and thousands of people were carrying around empty jerry cans around the city. I'm Spartacus.
That's beautiful.
Yeah,
Oh,
it was very exciting. It was very everybody was very jubilant, and hopeful.
that's a beautiful development in
Mhm.
spite of these monsters trying to essentially enslave us all to some type of techno utopian grid. The
Yeah,
people have come together and they're supporting one another, and they have to reveal the true monstrosity behind the scenes, their fundamentalist nature.
yeah,
And your book does an incredible job of revealing this is really the ultimate fundamental issue behind these types of totalitarian drives in society, and it's this inability to cede power, to hear different perspectives. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you define fundamentalism, and how do you see it as relating to the concept of gnosis?
Well, I have a very particular idea about fundamentalism. It might not be the commonly accepted one, but let me just tell you how I use the word in the book and in the context of my book. Um, I would say that the way I use fundamentalism is that it is inexorably linked to the exercise of power. And in the exercise of power, the fundamentalists will try and link a religion to their exercise of power in order to give it a pious face
Yes.
and in order to give themselves a legitimacy because they are morally superior,
Hmm.
enlightened beings. So it's seizing the moral high ground. I would see fundamentalism as being an empty shell. So it's the form of godliness without the content, zero content, the empty vessel. And we can see the template of it in the Pharisees of the New Testament. And it's like a pattern that has repeated itself and continues to repeat itself. I compare it to a fractal pattern. A fractal pattern is a particular pattern in nature that there is a repeating pattern, but in a different form. But it's the same thing essentially. So the analogy would be a head of broccoli. So if you clip off a little piece of the broccoli, the tiny piece that you've clipped off doesn't have the same shape as the head, but it's the same thing.
Right.
So what I'm talking about in my book is that fundamentalism is not confined to what we normally think of as being people who take the Bible literally. I'm not talking about your average churchgoer or even your average churchgoer who takes things literally, because there's usually some moral content in what they are doing. There's a phrase in the secret book of John that describes the work of the demiurge. We'll get into the demiurge, but it's anti-maimon pneuma, and the phrase means counterfeiting spirit.
Mm.
So what I'm talking about here is a counterfeiting spirit, but there's more to the phrase than that. It's a counterfeit that actually goes contrary to the thing that it's trying to counterfeit. So it's like an inversion.
Yes.
It takes on the form of the religion. Take Constantine and Christianity. Constantine adopts Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, but then inverts it. So the Prince of Peace becomes an instrument of empire or of conquest. Constantine sees a vision of the cross with the inscription, "By this conquer." The Constantine and the Roman Empire take upon themselves the form of a pious face that justifies, they say, exterminating the Cathars or laying siege to cities. And people just are not able to see what's happening because they can only see the piety. And I think to themselves, well, it must be right, or it must be good. There must be a reason for it. How could these pious people, these priests, support such a thing? It reminds me a little bit of the Milgram experiment. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's
Yes.
It's where there was an experiment done where people in white coats were administering electrical shocks to people in response to questions. And if they got the questions wrong, there was a shock administered. But the people that were the pointed end of this were actors. So when they administered a shock, the person would scream, and then they would be instructed to administer ever-increasing dosages of electricity at the instructions of a person in a white coat with a clipboard. It's fine. It's all right. Don't worry. This is all part of the experiment. It's all taken care of, you know.
Yeah.
And an amazing number of people delivered what would have been lethal doses of electricity because they thought it came from an authoritative source. So that's what's going on with fundamentalism and with the religion that it adopts to give itself that moral high ground. It's all about capturing the moral high ground. So I have related fundamentalism to things that are not even religious, you know, that could be the fundamentalism of science, or it could be the fundamentalism of political doctrine or economic doctrine, and most recently, I would say the mother of all cults is the postmodernist religion. And here again, we'll be able to see postmodernism as an inversion of the original postmodernist philosophy. But postmodernism, to put it in a nutshell, would be the philosophy would be there's no such thing as an objective reality. There's no such thing as truth. That everything is a person's perceptions, and is no morality or is no reality to be discovered. Whereas the Enlightenment philosophers, John Locke and David Hume, the Age of Reason, the basic assumption there was that there is an external reality to be discovered, and it is discoverable by reason and debate and the scientific method, or in legal terms, the rules of evidence in court. There's a truth out there to be discovered.
Yes.
But the modern day postmodernists have taken something which was originally had some sense to it, that we don't necessarily discover the world by reason alone, but we can discover the world, say, by intuition or by our own
Insight.
mystical experiences. These are avenues to truth as well, but the postmodernists have inverted it to say there's no truth at all. Whereas, the Gnostic would say, well, there's many paths up the mountain to get to the top of the mountain, or you can blaze your own trail up the mountain.
Yes.
But there's still a mountain. It's the same mountain.
Yes.
Be discovered by different means. Or there's an old teaching story about a village of blind people that are trying to figure out what an elephant is, And one person would have the perception by touching its leg that it was a tree trunk, or by another person by touching the tail, they'd say it was a snake, or by touching the trunk, it was a hollow pipe or something like that. But so there is this aspect of postmodernism that is true, that everybody's got their own little piece of the puzzle. Everyone's got their own perception, and that nobody's seeing the whole elephant. But still, a valid form of postmodernism would say, well, there's still an elephant, there's a whole elephant to be discovered. But the modern postmodernism does not allow for that. It says,
how interesting.
But if you take that philosophy of modern day postmodernism to say there is no such thing as truth, then there can be no lies.
Yes.
There can be no lies. So what you find is people who adopt this philosophy actually lie so much because anything they can say is automatically true because it's true for them.
Yes.
And so you cannot actually reason. You cannot actually engage in a debate because they don't believe in it, because they believe that everybody has their own truth, you see. There's nothing to be discovered here. So the reason that when you get you cannot really engage in a debate with a postmodernist because they will instantly go to denunciation. There's no such thing as truth, and therefore there's no use talking. So what you're left with is a power struggle.
Right.
It's all power relations. And it's all about oppressor versus oppressed. So they only understand things in those terms. So their idea is to get power in the situation. So you may notice when you're watching a so-called debate between a postmodernist and someone who is not a postmodernist, from the get-go, it goes to denunciation.
Wow.
You may notice that.
Yes. Oh, wow.
So one of the characteristics of fundamentalism, one of the common characteristics of it that I allude to a lot is the demonization of the opposition. They instantly go to the demonization of the opposition. And words mean whatever they say they mean. So violence can mean anything.
Right.
It can mean, well, what you said upset me, therefore it's violence.
Right.
And with this pervasiveness of postmodernism, you're even seeing it creeping into the law. I refer in the book to perception-based recording of hate crimes.
Wow.
So if someone perceives you as being hateful, or in order to uncover the hateful component of a hate crime, you are not to challenge the person who's making the accusation because that's their reality. So with that, you see a subversion of the legal process. You see someone who has made an accusation is automatically right. So this idea of innocent until proven guilty is being eroded away by the pervasiveness of this philosophy.
That's incredible. And that's what we've seen playing out with microaggressions and, the Me Too movement, which was really just a way to take take the attention away from pedophilia and sex trafficking and put it on something, you know, more tolerable, a sexual assault against women by and large.
Yeah.
Yeah. And fascinating because this kind of solipsistic, satanic inversion of all principles where subjectively they can dominate any conversation, immediately it becomes a battle to see who is more pious, and all the piety is supposed and imagined instead
Yeah.
of actualized. So it's very self-contained and destructive by nature. And so
Yeah.
and here we
Very
are. It's
corrosive
very,
of
very
the culture.
absolutely.
And going back to the Pharisees, Jesus called them whited sepulchres. Outwardly, they appear righteous and pious and woke now, but
Right.
inwardly full of rottenness and dead men's bones. On the inside, there's nothing there. It's just all this pious posturing, the
Yes.
whited sepulchres. So it's
Oh,
all about attaching itself to political power.
yes.
Always has been. And it didn't even begin with the Pharisees. There was the priestly caste of the Old Testament, and before that, so there's nothing new in it. It's pervasive, and it's always been with us. As Philip K. Dick says, the empire never ended.
Wow. So this is truly the fundamental issue of our time, which is whether or not we can identify this and understand its nature, and then come up with checks and balances to avoid this ever happening again. And
Yes.
that's our hope. That's our hope, because with this COVID pandemic, really a scamdemic, the elite have weaponized this to the point of global takeover. And they have, they're trying to roll out God knows what's in the vaccines. It could be some type of, first of all, modifying your DNA. Second of all, making you a potential antenna to receive Wi-Fi via 5G that could manipulate your consciousness and hijack us all.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is intense to look back to, say, the Nag Hammadi period and see them warning of this, the spiritual warfare. And here we have it manifesting and merging with silicon in a way that could essentially terraform all of us.
Yes. Which kind of takes us into another form of fundamentalism, scientism, and
Yeah.
transhumanism. Another common characteristic of fundamentalism is the utopian vision.
Right.
You see it in Marxism. You see it in now in this transhumanist agenda, which is through merging with machine, man and machine, and the use of technology will enter a period which will be a golden age where we can conquer death, where we can cure all disease. And this is going to be like in the church that I belong to, they called it the wonderful world tomorrow if we only signed up for the utopian agenda. The utopianism of that time was obedience. If we must obey all of God's laws, and the reason everything's going to hell in the world is because people aren't obeying God's laws. Therefore, if we can find out what God's laws are and obey them, then we can have happy marriages and well-behaved children, and no longer will we have sickness amongst us. The same basic thing, just repeating itself in a clever disguise. And the challenge for me has been to recognize these clever disguises. So when I came out of it, of course, I was inoculated against that thing or anything similar to it. But then it starts showing up in clever disguises in different places that are unrecognizable. And then after a while, you say, hey, this is giving me a very familiar feeling here. I'm starting to get a sense of deja vu,
Right.
And it was the repeating pattern in a different guise. Scientism,
Yes.
and
Transhumanism.
all these things are offering us a utopian vision of the future.
Yes. So they have to sell us in a naive, idealized future state, where if we just give up our sovereignty, they'll succor us and take care of us for any of all fears and concerns are going to be handled by Big Daddy State.
That's right. Yes. And Big Daddy State then becomes the new God.
Yes.
You don't get rid of religion by banning it. So they ban religion, but then they have a new religion and a new God.
That's right.
God being the state.
Yes, the latest scheme.
Yeah.
And interesting. So how old were you when you joined the church that you
Oh
built?
my, I was only 14 when I started getting into it. I was really naive, and um, there was a very charismatic leader who I call the Wizard,
Hmm,
and he was something that somebody who a young man would admire.
right.
Very charismatic, and um, the introduction to it wasn't religious. It was a secular, glossy magazine that eased you into it very gently. Um, and then I joined their church, and from there I went to their college, which is a liberal arts college. I graduated from there with an undergraduate degree in theology. I went into the ministry, didn't last too long in the ministry. I was basically fired for insubordination, um, which really meant that I was teaching things that they didn't like. And when I refused to stop doing that, they fired me from my job as a minister. And then when they insisted that I not communicate my heretical thoughts to other members of the congregation, and I refused to do that, they essentially excommunicated me from the church. And so no
Hmm,
one at that point was able to communicate with me.
wow.
So it
So
was a huge trauma.
you were
Not only
banished.
banished, but the thing that you had invested a lot in terms of your relationship with the Almighty
Yes.
was so utterly disappointing. And then it's been a long time, sort of working my way through that in the aftermath to it.
Yes, I can imagine, and I can actually relate. I'll be explaining more about my own experience with my own encounters with these charismatic wizards who presume to have all the answers and understand the path, and then as you peek behind the curtain, you realize that most of their identity is a projection of their ego, and that their supposed moral tenets are really just a means to an end.
Yes. Yeah, the
Yes.
empty vessel.
Yes, the empty can rattles the most, it's been said.
Yeah, right.
Wow, so that's fascinating. So from age 14 and really, you described in the book how yourself and some of your friends there truly had this passion to serve and
Oh, yeah.
to devote yourselves truly, and
Very
so it's
devoted. Yeah.
absolutely, and so it's even more disconcerting because that energy is so precious, and for it to be, manipulated and exploited by someone who's, yeah,
Yeah.
it could be most people may not recover, and so I hope this interview will help those out there. If you've run into these types of characters in your own life, that you'll find some inspiration from Adrian's path and my own to just keep moving forward and individuate from those who would, want you to be a minion to their own ends and desires rather than what they had postured and presented, which is that they had a higher calling that they wanted to enlist your services with. But in the reality, it was just a kind of like a covert agenda to satisfy their own egoic drives and desires.
Yes.
So let's see. So, all right, moving forward. This is from chapter 4, Fundamentalism and Science. And it's a quote that says, "The biggest scientific delusion of all is that science knows the answers." And I'm just going to read a bit from the book here. It says, "When I read the Wizard's college prospectus, it invited students to think for themselves, to study and prove all things. We were led to believe it was an institution of higher learning dedicated to free thought and open minded inquiry. When it became clear that we had only been invited to prove the Wizard right and to think for ourselves only insofar as it conformed with church doctrine, the easiest way out was to forget the earlier promise in order to fit in and avoid being labeled a heretic." So you ran into the peer pressure of the mob, the mass mind being weaponized against you. And so that, of course, adds to the trauma. And we see the corollary in this mass, scamdemic, where if you're not accepting the mark of the beast, if you're not wearing a mask that's been proven to be completely insufficient to stop any virus, let alone that it's never been isolated, So these are absolutely uh, fundamental issues that we have to address, because this is how they've been able to control mankind since time immemorial. And using phrases like "trust the science," it was totally oppositional to the real imperative of science, which is open-minded inquiry, being willing to challenge results, and being forced to reproduce them independently. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see this as it relates to the concept in Gnosticism of the archons? And how would you define the archons?
Well, archons simply means rulers or authorities.
Yes.
Uh, I would see this as a pyramid that there are different layers. Uh, there are kings and presidents and prime ministers. These are mostly puppets. But on top of that, you have organizations like BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, which are giant hedge funds who have major ownership positions in all corporations. And I think the top of the pyramid in human terms is probably the financial sector. Amschel Rothschild said in the 1800s, give me control of a country's money supply, and I care not who makes the laws. So it's all about the money.
Yes.
And we're even seeing that now played out in the aftermath to the Ottawa protest, is that the ultimate weapon has been to freeze bank accounts.
Hmm.
And the emergencies powers legislation enables the government to freeze anybody's bank account anywhere in Canada without oversight, without recourse.
Jeez.
So people who have made donations to the trucker convoy protest are having their bank accounts frozen. When you think about that, that is the ultimate form of dependency.
Yes.
You cannot get to your bank account. You cannot pay your mortgage. You cannot pay your bills. The only thing that you have left is any cash that you might have on your possession, or perhaps gold and silver or whatever. But of course, they're trying to get rid of cash. So the
Yes.
ultimate control mechanism will be the money.
Just turn your bank account off because you're a dissident. You have the wrong ideas, and now you're
That's it.
impoverished immediately.
You're screwed right off the bat.
You're screwed. Good luck with it. Yeah, you're relegated to third world status
So carrying on
instantaneously.
up the hierarchy, well, what's behind that? I tend to think myself, I believe in the Christian concept of wicked spirits in high places.
Yes.
We're in a spiritual war. We're in a spiritual battle. And so it doesn't end with human beings, I don't think. Other people disagree with that, but that's my view of it anyway. So I see the archons as being real spiritual entities.
Yes, I agree.
Or
And
interdimensional entities, fallen angels. They could go by a lot of different terms of this world, you might say.
very good. I mean, it's becoming more and more apparent that there is something absolutely insidious and wicked behind the scenes. You can see it in the eyes of these puppets, people like, Trudeau or Peter Strzok. Have you seen the footage of Peter Strzok when he's being forced to testify, and he has the duping delight of a psychopath? He's kind of like squirming in his seat with like sick joy at the fact that he's getting attention and supply.
Oh, yes.
It's
Oh, I know
really
what you're
something.
talking about. Yeah.
So
I've
they
seen
are.
it.
You have seen it. It's
I've
something.
seen it exactly. That's sort of a delight.
Yes.
They
Yeah.
delight, and they're laughing at you. They're
It's
laughing
the
at it. They think it's amusing.
Yes. It's sadism. Their sadism, their hatred, and their desire to see us suppressed gives
Here's
them
another
joy.
one for you.
Uh-huh.
One of the threats. Now, this protest in Ottawa was like Family Day. A lot of these truckers, they just have a pet for company. when they go on these long haul trips. Part of the threat to them was that they were going to take their pets and euthanize them.
Oh my God.
People who didn't have perhaps the normal family life, but all they had was their pet.
Yes.
And now this is true wickedness.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of parallels to psychopathy, narcissism,
Yeah.
a lot of the personality disorders that are most associated with the so-called 1%. So perhaps our species is ruled over since the beginning of time by forces who have infiltrated and aligned with the darkest power, imagined as a satanic embodiment or principle of evil. And the Gnostics seem to have been revealing that in a way that the Catholic Church and others have totally suppressed.
Yes.
And are there any documents in particular as it relates to Gnosticism that render that most evident or clear? Or are there any books that have most inspired you in this understanding, more holistic Christian understanding of what these principalities truly represent and how they, yes, please go on.
I would say The Secret Book of John is one of my favorites, with the Stephan Davies translation with an excellent commentary. That's a really good one. I really like the Gospel of Thomas. And Gnosticism can be understood by reading the works of famous Gnostics. Philip K. Dick, for example, is a self-avowed, or was a self-avowed Gnostic. And he really illuminates Gnosticism through his works and movies that are based on his works, like Minority Report and Blade Runner. And you'll see in a lot of these films a theme emerges that the reality that you think is real isn't real. The person that you're married to, who you think is your loving wife, is actually not. You know, the reality that you've come to accept as every day is something that needs to be challenged.
Yes.
I also like the works of Carl Jung. Anything by Carl Jung is very Gnostic. He was also a self-proclaimed Gnostic.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Okay. And
I'll just say this much. If anybody wants to find out what Gnosticism is all about, I do have a bibliography on my blog site, which is a prisonforthemind.blog, with books and links to sites like thegodabovegods.com. Miguel Connor is the go-to place for all things Gnostic research.
Agreed.
Books. And,
Miguel's great.
and a living example of what a Gnostic looks like, I think.
Yes.
Because he interviews a lot of people with a lot of different views, and he doesn't agree with all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but he is extremely welcoming of other points of view and accepting of them. And that's what I love about him.
Absolutely. I've seen him multiple times, and sometimes I've actually been worried because he's been interviewing certain Satanists, getting their perspective, and to me, you know, that raises the hair on my neck a little bit, because
I know that he has had dilemmas with certain individuals. I understand the source of the dilemma. He wants to, entertain all points of view, but the last thing he wants is censorship. But there is a place where you have to draw the line, and no one wants to do that.
Yes. Wonderful teacher Miguel is. He's been at this for at least 15 years plus, and of course all the time previous. And he's one of the most entertaining. He's got an incredible sense of humor, and he's just the spirit he provides to the work, I think, is very instructive as to how we should all proceed. It's just, we're going to disagree in certain things, but overall we're trying to understand the great mystery together. So all sides should be heard and included.
Mm-hmm.
And as it relates to consciousness, I'm quoting from you here, on the double slit experiment, it is necessary for an observer to bring reality into existence, which mirrors the Aboriginal belief that we dream reality into existence. So I wanted to ask you, what techniques or tools might the modern neo-Gnostic apply to be able to bend reality to a better end than those of the archons of the day and the techniques that they've used by and large mainstream media?
Okay. There's a verse that comes to me from the Gospel of Thomas. If you bring forth that which is within you, that which is within you will save you.
Hmm.
If you do not bring forth that which is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. So the emphasis in Gnosticism as a technique of spiritual development and evolution is to go within and to bring forth that which is within you, to find your truth within you and to express it. So it's very much related to artistic expression. And so I think I would say to anyone, develop the artistic side. So this is where positive side of postmodernism comes in. Before it got inverted by the postmodernists of the 1960s, there is an avenue to truth that can be a mystical experience, but it wouldn't be just your own truth. It would be, as we were discussing earlier about natural law, you would be accessing something that is universal. The mountain that we climb, it's a real mountain, although there's different paths up it. But the avenue to it is yourself. And that is the Gnostic approach. Don't go to look to some external authority to tell you what the truth is, but discover it for yourself through your own revelation, your own interior revelation. So I think, if you were to consider someone being trained by another artist, for example, learning to be an artist, that person would want you as soon as possible to develop your own artistic creation. They would be encouraging that, to bring it forth from you. They wouldn't be telling you what good art is.
Right. Well said.
Yeah, they would be encouraging you to be the best that you could be and to express yourself in that way. So that would be a good technique. Everyone has their own way of climbing the mountain. For me, I like to be in nature. I like to work in the woods. I like to do forestry, plant trees, build trails, bridges. And when I do that, do the thing that I love or I enjoy, I'm doing that for a while, I will sometimes sit back and say to myself, wow, that's been 2 hours where I haven't been thinking about anything negative or anything worrying or any anxieties that I might have. And so anything that you can do to get yourself away from these sad stories that we tell ourselves all the time, these memes that rob us of our energy, and the various spiritual techniques like meditation or different kinds of meditation. I'm not big on sitting meditations because, for one thing, at my age, I don't like sitting around too much because I'm always sitting around. And so I like moving meditations more. I do Tai Chi,
Excellent.
I do yoga. Everybody would find their own thing that works for them.
Yes.
But I can tell you what I do, but that's not for everybody.
Well, Bruce Lee is one of my all-time idols and instructors, and that was something that he continuously advises, that find your own way. His whole art form, Jeet Kune Do, his philosophy, it really instructed you to be an individual and to find your own path.
Right.
Understand that everyone was absolutely different in their own way and had their own insights. So, in your book also, you visited a place called Crater Lake in Southern Oregon, and you had something like an epiphany there. Would you like to explain a little bit of that spiritual experience and how it's maybe changed you or inspired you?
Yes. Well, the background to that was that I was visiting sacred sites. I was on something that you might call a pilgrimage. I was looking for it. I was looking for inspiration, looking for guidance. And I really recommend the idea of a pilgrimage to some sacred place or some sacred site. It sort of sets it sets your intention. So mentally you're prepared for it. In the context of that too, I've been doing a lot of things. I've been doing sweat lodges with Native Americans and sunrise ceremonies with the Shoshone people, experimenting in a lot of different things, a lot of different cultures. I'm very left-brained, and I was doing some not very left-brained things for a long time. And this was setting me up, I think, for something of this nature. It was an experience of that just came over me one evening out of the blue in the context of what I was talking about. And it was just like a complete sense of well-being that I'd never experienced in my entire life. And that it was like a revelation that this was the ultimate reality. Tears came to my eyes and an overwhelming sense of gratitude. And there was no,
Beautiful.
no angels appearing or, apparitions or anything like that. It was just a period where I felt like I had apprehended a certain background state of reality that was there, and I somehow stumbled on it. And it was just glorious.
Yes.
The only thing that was sort of somewhat paranormal about it, perhaps, was an inner voice or a voice that seemed to be speaking to me that said, you will be grateful for this, and you should remember it.
Wow.
But you will soon be returning to your normal state. But remember it.
Yes.
And that's been the case. I can remember it, but I can't reproduce it at will. But
Yes.
That's how I've treated it. And oh yes, so the sad stories that you've been making your life miserable is, they're not real. It's just you. It's just your mind, making up shit or interpreting stuff, these sad stories. And so, these sad stories seem really real to me. The reason to be miserable and anxious, afraid, it all seems rather real.
Yes.
This voice is telling me, no, it's not real. This is real.
That's profound. I love it.
So,
like a rebirth.
This background state of reality does not depend on where you are, how you feel. So you might feel like it's not there, or but that doesn't change anything. You can't get away from this, You can't escape this. And I think one day we'll all return to that.
Wow.
From this place of confusion and lies and self-deceptions. You can be your own fundamentalist preacher,
That's right.
Take all the evidence that supports your sad theory or your sad story, right, and throw out all the evidence to the contrary. We do it all the time,
It's true. And it's something like the ego, it's this quantum computer persona that can siphon all of the energy and the inputs of your senses and reroute them to its own gestation and feeding. And becoming disconnected from it through these spiritual practices seems to be the goal. And then what is there is that epiphany, that land where you have a blank slate, where you're just perception, you're just the witness, and that witness is able to recalibrate somehow, so that diseases can instantaneously dissolve in some people, mental and otherwise. So the healing that Christ was able to perform may have been a result of him attaining higher levels of consciousness and bringing other people into that field.
Yeah.
And I think absolutely,
that's a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
And a real church, I think, does that for people. So to Miguel's credit, I think he's built a church that is so open-minded that, and no one's excluded. And I commend him for that, because I've always felt incredibly welcome listening to him. I've always felt heard. And the Gnostics, you describe how in their spaces it was non-hierarchical. They realized that everyone had something to contribute to the great story of our being.
Yes.
And that's something I've always sought. And I was somewhat disappointed, to say the least, where I helped someone become rather famous, and came to realize after the fact that it was very much about them
Oh, yeah.
rather than the medicine that I wanted to manifest for myself and others by creating a space where all ideas could be heard. And in so doing, we immediately seem to collapse the waveform to our betterment, because now those excluded aspects can be integrated, like Carl Jung describing with the shadow. So if we're
Yes.
going to integrate the mass shadow, we have to actually hear one another. We have to say, look, why do we have children huffing paint and eating cardboard soup in barrios in Brazil when we have absolute abundance? It's
Mhm.
because of this money system, this mon eye, the one eye that
Yeah.
is being fed continuously. And what is it rooted in? Babylonian black magical
Black
systems and
magic.
secret societies
Oh,
such as
yes.
Freemasonry. And they have their own fundamentalism. They claim that they're going to, through Tikkun Olam, fix the world, the world being broken post flood. But then we've had multiple floods. So it seems like coming to grips with the reality that our world is a battleground, and that it could be a threshold for advanced souls going to another state, or it's the ultimate proving ground where we have to fix the world, not by I don't know, obscuring the dark aspects, but integrating, saying, yeah, we have had clandestine vampirism masquerading through, with the mask of piety throughout time, leading people astray, and then getting them hooked in this kind of, I guess you'd say, uh, what am I trying to say here? The substitute for the epiphany you experience, the real knowing. You get something like a comfortable lifestyle or a hedonistic supply, on tap, whether it's through being notoriety, fame,
Fame. Oh,
achievement.
right, right. I know what you mean. Yeah. Mhm.
And at the end of the day, we're here approximately 100 years on average at most. So it's really fooling ourselves to think that, such grandiosity is worth much. How many people will even know we were here in a
Yeah,
century?
exactly. Yes, we're not as important as we think we are.
And that's the terrifying aspect, because then so many of these people, they have cults of personality
Mm.
where they sell you on, oh yeah, we're going to fix the world, we're
Oh,
going to
yeah.
change things, but really they want you to change their bottom line, and they want you to change their status.
They're just
And
parasites.
just parasites. And they
Yeah.
often look like they're dealing with parasites themselves, but that's neither here nor there.
Mhm.
So let's see. I love this. The Gnostics appear to enshrine individuality and dismiss hierarchical control games in their gatherings. You describe the spirit of this type of unifying interplay in Chapter 6, Unnatural Selection, thusly. Some time ago, I was invited to participate in a men's talking circle based on Native American tradition. Each participant would take turns talking about meaningful and significant personal matters. When someone was speaking, no one else was allowed to interrupt, debate, or argue. The idea was to create a supportive environment in which authenticity and openness was fostered. Each participant would hold a feather and during his turn, then pass it to the next person in the circle, the feather indicating who had the floor. Someone in the group was going through a marital separation, and he spoke of the sadness and loneliness he was experiencing. At first, I was quite reluctant. What would I say? I began by recounting the events of that week and their impact on my life. It wasn't much at first, but a lot, excuse me, it wasn't much at first. I scrolled for a second. It wasn't much at first, but the feather would soon return, and I would always have another chance to say more. A lifetime of religious, political, and corporate indoctrination had produced within me an extreme caution about speaking my mind or revealing myself too much. I was
Mm.
suspicious of the notion that I would not be judged or criticized. Even though reluctant at first, something about this experience felt right. What a contrast with those feelings of dread and discomfort on my first day at the Wizards College. It dawned on me. This is exactly how the Gnostics arranged their meetings. Each person would speak about their own revelations, inspirations, dreams, or visions in an atmosphere of complete non judgment and acceptance. There were no doctrines to impose from high, no debates about the correct way of seeing things. The circle is a symbol of unity and equality. This creates a kind of sacred space where amazing things can happen and a bond of unity can be forged. Since then, I have had an ambition, unrealized as yet, to erect an authentic Native American teepee on our land. I have envisioned people sitting around the teepee fire, freely expressing themselves one by one. Where the spirit flows freely, who knows what will be revealed? And you relate this type of non authoritarian model for voluntary interaction among individuals was anathema to the ambitions of those who co opted proto Christianity or Gnosticism and then sought to suppress any records of this movement from the history books. And they did this because they wanted to prevent nonconformists seeking their own gnosis from becoming awake to their schemes, to their plans to essentially make you subservient to their ambitions. And so truly, this is the microcosmic individual imperative that we have to manifest what is within in order to overcome these types of archontic forces, lest we be enslaved by them. And so I wanted to ask you, you discussed the law of personal sovereignty. How do you see that as relating to the hero's journey? And what do you think are the wizards of this world, so to speak, here to prompt us to that evolutionary imperative? Is that your perspective now more so?
Yeah, I'm going that way. I'm leaning in that direction, that they are actually agents of our awakening. That we are complicit in our own deception.
Yes.
That they require our permission. And that when we withdraw our permission, we start living our own authentic truth, live according to your purpose, your divine purpose, discover what that purpose is and live it. That's why I love animals. I adore animals because they're just beavers cut down trees. They know what they're here for.
Right.
Groundhogs dig holes. I got one digging holes around my house, and I think surely there's enough holes here now. But no. They're going to keep on digging, no matter what you do. They're totally themselves.
Yes.
So living your authentic self is the way forward. Yeah.
Beautiful. And ultimately this is what this challenge is now, is like, people who are wearing a mask. It's so, the symbolism is just so apparent. It's literally on our faces. Will you be yourself or will you wear a mask?
You'll hide. You're
you
hiding.
hide.
Yeah. It's a talisman. It's a symbol of subservience and obedience.
That's right.
It serves absolutely no purpose.
That's right.
I think the virus is like 3 microns, and the hole in the fabric is like 60 microns. It's like trying to stop a sandstorm with a chain link fence.
Right.
So, and why would you be upset that someone else wasn't wearing a mask? Because you're protected, right? So what do you care what is somebody else wearing? But you get people freaking out that someone else is not wearing a mask. Like some psychotic break or something.
That's what it is. And it's really, this is the human condition. Throughout time, we have people that they've allowed themselves to be hacked and hijacked by some supposed, authority. And then rather than reconcile that within themselves and stand on their own 2 feet, they essentially look to dominate others who are reminding them of that essential failure to individuate.
Yeah, and I wrote down a quote from the Matrix movie, the original one, that is right to this point. You have to understand, most of these people, are not ready to be unplugged.
Right.
And many of them are so inured, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it.
Right. So
when they see someone that is not plugged in as they are, it makes them angry.
That's right.
It says the Matrix is a system, Neos. The system is our enemy. But when you're inside, you look around. What do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters. The very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still part of that system, and that makes them our enemy, because they're going to be very angry with you.
Yes.
Perhaps it holds up a mirror. I'm going along with this. I shouldn't be going along with it. And subconsciously, they recognize that.
And immediately what happens when you're banished or excommunicated is that you are put on your walkabout. You're put on a pilgrimage back to yourself.
Yeah.
And it can be harrowing, but that harrowing journey is actually what's going to ready you for your ultimate purpose. And so avoiding the spiritual path is forsaking your own divinity. And I see it. You know, I see, here I'm been here in Texas for a minute, walking around Austin, and it's the same in Atlanta. It's the same in New York. You know, you see young people working for Whole Foods, which is Amazon, which is CIA, Jeff Bezos, and you know they conveniently provided. It's interesting how they cooked all of us, slow cooked us. Where okay, everyone, you get it instead of a snow day, like you miss a day from school, you get a snow year. Everyone gets time off from work. So, oh my God, yeah, how many people chomping at the bit to just be able to relax finally out of the grind? But and then, oh, well, you know what? You can just order groceries. You don't have to touch anybody. You don't have to be within 6 feet of anyone. You don't have to make eye contact anymore. You can just let Amazon provide for you all that you need. And speaking of Philip K. Dick, actually, Amazon created a science fiction miniseries, a lot of shorts based on his novellas and other books.
Mm-hmm.
And in one particular episode, they have like Amazon merged with Skynet in the future, and everything is brought to people by drones. But if you're in any way, yeah, the same idea. If you're any way, shape, or form a dissident, you realize that you know the same drone that's delivering you groceries could just napalm your entire family into smithereens. And here we are, we funded this monstrosity because we're people are afraid to go on this walkabout because you'll have to become the lowly humbled outlier who's now disconnected from the grid of sustenance as they see it, but it's not true. I'll talk to people in the system and I'll say, you don't have to wear the mask. You just protest. And by the way, OSHA, previous to COVID, none of this was allowed. And I'll show them a video of Del Bigtree, who's a phenomenal activist. And he did a video with his son where he placed his son in a mask and he showed the OSHA guidelines for the amounts of CO2 that were considered safe previous to COVID. And within 30 seconds of wearing this mask, it's so beyond their most egregious offender or the most concentrated CO2, which is most devastating to health. And this young man's 10 years old, and he's breathing this toxic air. He's rebreathing bacteria, and it's
Mm-hmm.
within 30 seconds. It's off. I'll plug it in the show, but it's off the charts. And so these are people that have been wearing these masks now for 2 years for 8 hours plus a day and letting their children wear these masks,
Yeah.
which is, it's creating retardation. It's creating social issues because they're not able to witness microtics and other, I guess you'd say, nonverbal cues.
Mm-hmm.
And so here we are, because they've conformed, they're being devolved essentially and being made more pliable for the next round of God knows what they have in store for us. So ultimately, if you're out there and if you're still wearing a mask, just take it off. Just see what happens. Don't take it personal if people rail against you. Those aren't your friends. They're asleep in the matrix and you're not. And you'll find your tribe if you have the courage to step outside of that. But man,
The
it's
only act of violence that I'm aware of or that I saw in a video during these recent protests was someone tried to run over with his car some of the trucker protesters.
oh my God.
And someone took a picture of it, and he was inside his car, he was wearing a mask.
Oh my God.
And you'll see that all the time, people driving around by themselves wearing a mask.
Yeah, what is that?
It's,
What is that?
I think it's a talisman. Maybe some magical thing will happen to keep them safe from it.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
I was in the
I get
hospital. Sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was in the hospital in the spring and they had me in a mask. The nurse comes around and takes my vitals. And she says, "Oh, my, your oxygen is low."
Mm.
And she says, "Take your mask off for a minute." That's it. And then she takes the reading again. "Oh, now you're okay."
Wow.
And then I said, "Well, that should tell you something." And she says, "Yeah." So
But she's still plugged into the system, and that you got to give them credit. They've figured out
yeah.
over the years how to essentially make us obedient in spite of direct evidence that it's impacting our health negatively on every level, mind, body, and spirit. Oh man.
And I saw a video of a mask mandate being lifted in a school. And okay, kids, you can take your masks off now.
Oh,
You
yes.
should have seen the eruption of joy. I mean, these kids were jumping up and down and cheering, and oh, what a torment for them for 2 years to be placed in that. Children are zero risk from this virus.
COVID.
Yeah.
Oh, and then you'll see politicians posing next to them without their mask. So the whole thing is just ridicule, dark satire, put it
Oh,
in your face.
yeah,
We're your
that's
owners.
what it is, isn't it?
Look how we treat your children. You're not responsible enough to protect your children from us because you delegate authority to us to raise them, essentially. And my hope with the Great Awakening is that now that it's been compounded on so many levels that people will break free, and that also those children will recover and never forget, yes, this is the pain, this is the price of avoiding sovereignty, of avoiding the
That
burden
is,
of your own individual responsibility.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
my hope.
yeah. We're being steered in the direction of our own sovereignty. Yeah, I think that's what's happening. So, yeah,
I agree. And there's so many wake up calls from say 9/11 to,
yeah.
oh, I mean, I think most if unless you're just lacking any individual rigor or backbone whatsoever, you have to know that there's something off about the 9/11 story at this point.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I worked with AE911truth.org, Richard Gage, and other activists uh, for over a decade, and it was nice to see people coming together. They actually did a billboard campaign that was in multiple countries. They erected 3 towers of light on the 9/11 anniversary, on the 10th anniversary, to show that Building 7, the third tower, which was not hit by a plane, show that to the masses who had been totally scrubbed down the memory hole with mainstream media. But it's one of these good talismans that can immediately prompt people to see the matrix for what it is, to see the new world order. And it culminated in, so they destroyed these 2 towers, which the whole thing was a satanic ritual. There's a great book, 9/11 as a Mass Ritual by S.K. Bain. I recommend anyone who may be skeptical of that claim, read that book and then get back to me. But what do? They Hegelian dialectic, they destroy the 2 pillars, the gateway. They
Mm.
synthesize them into the one world tower, which looks like a giant syringe in New
Oh,
York City.
oh my God. Yeah.
So speaking of talismans, it's all there. It's not hidden.
It's all spelled out, isn't it? Yeah.
It's all spelled out, yes. And, one of these days we'll awaken, and this might be the period where it happens. And speaking of which, tomorrow is the anniversary of Pluto's return or birthday, and exactly where Pluto was in the heavens 248 years ago, figured the American Revolution, July 4th,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was
1776.
reading that post
Strange days.
this very significant day, isn't it? Yeah.
It seems to be that these cosmic cycles, they they provide opportunity for the dominant egregore or mindset to inform reality, and I'm hoping that this shift
Mm.
could provide the catalyst for overcoming these forces, hopefully for long term. Maybe we could finally break free, because it seems to be something that has been going on for at least as long as humans have been on this plane.
That's for sure.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's strange.